The dust of 1,000 miles caked her throat, a relentless grit that had settled deep into the fabric of her dreams. For Sarah Jenkins, the journey west was a desperate gamble on a stranger's promise, the photograph of a man named Jacob Miller clutched in her sweat-slicked palm. His letters spoke of sun-drenched valleys in the Montana Territory, a sprawling ranch, and a new beginning, far from the soot-stained tenements of Chicago. When his cabin finally appeared on the horizon, a lonely sentinel against a vast bruised sky, he was there on the porch, just as she'd pictured. He was a silhouette of a man with a welcoming smile and a wide-open door. But some doors, once you walk through them, have a terrifying way of locking behind you. The world, as Sarah Jenkins had known it, was a place of brick and clamour of narrow alleys and the ceaseless grind of factory gears. It smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. Hope was a flickering candle in a tenement window, easily extinguished by the slightest breeze of misfortune. At 24, an orphan since the fever, took her parents 5 years prior. Her life was a narrow track leading from the drudgery of the textile mill to her small cold room. The future was a grey, featureless wall she was walking toward. Then came the advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. It was a small, unassuming block of text tucked between notices for patent medicines and agricultural equipment. Homestead rancher, sober and industrious, seeks a good woman of character to share in the building of a life in the Montana Territory. Object matrimony. The name below was Jacob Miller. To write the first letter was an act of audacious hope. To receive a reply was a miracle. Jacob's letters, written in a surprisingly neat and steady hand, painted a picture not just of a life but of a paradise. He wrote of a valley cradled by mountains he called the sleeping giants, of air so clean it stung the lungs, and of a quiet so profound you could hear the whisper of an eagle's wings. He sent a photograph, a tintype of a man in his early 30s. He was not handsome in the classical sense, but his face was strong with kind eyes that seemed to crinkle at the corners and a sturdy set to his jaw. He looked directly at the camera, projecting an honesty that seemed as solid and dependable as the mountains he described. He had built his own cabin, he wrote from the pines that grew on his land. He had a small herd of cattle and a spring that ran cold and clear all year round. All he was missing, he confessed with a disarming humility, was a partner, a wife. For 6 months, their letters crossed the continent. Sarah found herself falling not just for the life he offered, but for the man who wrote the words. He was thoughtful, asking about her days at the mill, her health, her dreams, or hers. He never once spoke ill of anyone. He mentioned his first wife, Maria, only once describing her as a fragile soul whom the harshness of the first winter had stolen away. His grief felt palpable on the page, a quiet, dignified sorrow that made Sarah's heart ache for him. He was a man who had known loss just as she had. They were two solitary souls, reaching for each other across an impossible distance. When he sent the train ticket, it felt as heavy as a gold ingot in her hand. It was the price of a new world. Packing was a simple affair. She owned little of value, her mother's silver locket, a well-worn Bible, and 2 sturdy dresses. The women at the mill watched her with a mixture of envy and pity. To them, she was either incredibly brave or impossibly foolish, entrusting her entire existence to a man she'd never met, a ghost in a photograph. The journey itself was a brutal, jarring rebirth. The train ride was 3 days of clattering wheels and a constantly shifting landscape of humanity. Faces blurred into a collage of hope and exhaustion. Then came the stagecoach from Bozeman, a bone-rattling ordeal across a land so vast and empty it threatened to swallow her whole. The driver, a leathery old man named Jedediah Jed Stone, pointed out landmarks with a tobacco-stained finger. "That there's the Bridger Range," he'd grunted. "Get lost in them hills, and the wolves'll be picking at your bones 'fore the snow flies." Sarah clutched her satchel, the photograph of Jacob, a talisman against the raw, untamed wilderness. This was his world, It was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. The sky was an immense, overwhelming blue, the mountains jagged and indifferent. Could she, a woman of brick and pavement, ever belong here? Jedediah Stone spoke little, but when he learned her destination, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Jacob Miller's place, you say? Up in the Shadow Creek Valley? Yes. Do you know him? Sarah asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Jed spat a stream of brown juice onto the dusty trail. Folks round here mostly keep to themselves. Shadow Creek is about as to itself as it gets. Miller, he comes to town for supplies, quiet man, pays his bills. That's all I know. The assessment was neither a warning nor an endorsement, and its neutrality was somehow more unsettling than outright disapproval. Finally, after another 4 hours of jolting travel, Jed pulled the team to a halt. This is as far as the main track goes. His place is about 2 miles up that draw. He pointed toward a narrow gap in the rolling foothills. He said he'd be looking for you. Her legs felt weak as she stepped down from the coach. The silence rushed in to fill the space left by the rattling wheels. It was a living thing, buzzing with the hum of insects and the distant cry of a hawk. Jed tipped his hat. Good luck to you, miss. And with a crack of the whip, he was gone, leaving her in a cloud of dust and a profound sense of isolation. She stood there for a moment, a small, solitary figure at the edge of an immense wilderness. This was it, the final steps of a 1,000-mile journey. Taking a deep breath that tasted of pine and clean earth, she picked up her single heavy bag and began to walk. The draw was steeper than it looked. Twice she had to stop, her city-softened lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sun was hot on her shoulders. She was just beginning to feel a prickle of genuine fear, the terrifying thought that she was lost when she rounded a bend and saw it. The cabin stood in a small clearing nestled against a stand of tall aspen trees, whose leaves trembled in the breeze. It was exactly as he had described, sturdy, well-built, with a stone chimney, from which a thin tendril of smoke curled lazily into the sky. And on the porch, a man stood up from a rocking chair, wiping his hands on his trousers. It was him. He was taller than the photograph suggested, leaner with broad shoulders that filled out his simple cotton shirt. As she drew closer, she saw the kind eyes, the strong jaw. He wasn't smiling yet, just watching her, his expression one of quiet intensity. Sarah stopped about 20 feet from the porch, her bag suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. All the words she had practiced, all the clever and charming things she had thought to say, evaporated in the dry air. She could only stand there, her chest rising and falling, her bonnet askew. He broke the silence. His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, a low, pleasant baritone. So she could only nod, a lump forming in her throat. A slow smile spread across his face, and it transformed him. It was the crinkling, honest smile from the photograph, and it washed away her fear like a spring rain. He walked down the steps and came toward her, his stride long and confident. He didn't hesitate. He took the heavy bag from her hand, his fingers briefly brushing hers. His touch was warm and firm. Welcome, Sarah Jacob. Miller, said, his smile reaching his eyes. I've been waiting a long time. He gestured toward the cabin. The door's open. Come inside. You must be tired. He led her onto the porch and held the door one side. As Sarah stepped across the threshold from the overwhelming brightness of the wild into the cool, dim interior of the cabin, she felt a profound sense of relief. The open door, his warm smile, they were the fulfillment of the promise. This was home. She had made it. She had gambled everything, and she had won. The interior of the cabin was simple, clean, and masculine. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A handmade table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. A bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt, was tucked into a corner. Everything was orderly, scrubbed clean. It smelled of pine wood and coffee. It's lovely, Jacob, she said, her voice a little shaky. It's simple, he corrected gently, but it's strong. Built it myself. He set her bag down. Let me get you some water. You look like you've got half the trail on your face." He laughed, a soft, easy sound, and she found herself laughing with him, the tension of the long journey finally breaking. He brought her a dipper of water from a bucket by the door. It was the coldest, purest water she had ever tasted. As she drank, he watched her, his gaze appreciative, kind. "I was starting to worry," he admitted. "Jedediah's coach is usually earlier." "He said you keep to yourself," Sarah replied, repeating the driver's words. Jacob nodded, his smile fading slightly. "This valley, it doesn't invite company. That's part of why I chose it. A man can think out here. A man can build a life without the world poking its nose in." He looked at her. "Our life." The word "our" hung in the air, a beautiful, fragile thing. That first evening passed in a haze of hopeful discovery. He was a wonderful host. He cooked a simple but delicious meal of venison stew and fresh baked bread. He spoke of his plans for the ranch, how he wanted to expand the herd, build a larger barn, maybe even plant an apple orchard on the south-facing slope. He listened intently as she spoke of her life in Chicago, his expression sympathetic as she described the grime and the noise. He made her feel as though her thoughts were the most fascinating things he had ever heard. He showed her the small bedroom that had been added to the back of the cabin. "I built this for you," he said. "A woman needs her own space." The room was sparse, containing only a narrow bed and a small chest of drawers, but the window looked out onto the whispering aspen grove, and the gesture was one of profound respect. He would sleep on the main bed in the cabin's great room. He explained, until they were properly married by the traveling preacher, due in the valley in a month's time. As night fell, a deep, velvety blackness enveloped the cabin, studded with more stars than Sarah had ever imagined. The silence was no longer frightening, it was peaceful. Sitting at the table, the warm glow of a kerosene lamp pushing back the shadows, Sarah looked at Jacob Miller and felt a certainty settle in her soul. The suspicious driver, the overwhelming wilderness, the doubts of the women at the mill, they were all meaningless. Later, as she lay in her new bed, listening to the gentle sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, as Jacob moved about, the soft sigh of the dying fire, she clutched her mother's locket. She had arrived. She was safe. The man in the other room was good and kind. He had greeted a stranger with a smile and an open door, and she had walked through it into a new life. As she drifted off to sleep, lulled by the murmur of the creek outside her window, Sarah Jenkins believed with all her heart that her story had found its happy ending. The first week was an idyll, a rustic dream painted in the vibrant colors of an untouched autumn. Sarah woke each morning to the smell of coffee and the sight of the sun cresting the sleeping giants, spilling gold across the valley floor. Jacob was a patient teacher, showing her the ways of this new life. He taught her how to milk their single cow, Bess how to identify edible plants on the forest's edge, and how to knead bread with the sourdough starter he carefully nurtured. His hands, though calloused and strong, were gentle as he guided hers. His kindness was a constant, comforting presence. He would leave a wildflower on her pillow in the morning, or compliment the simple meals she prepared with a sincerity that made her blush. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, two people learning the dance of a shared life. Yet as the days bled into one another, Sarah began to notice small discordant notes in their peaceful symphony. The first was the isolation. It was more absolute than she could have conceived. In Chicago, she had craved solitude, a respite from the crushing proximity of others. Here, the silence was an entity in itself, a weight that pressed in from all sides. The nearest neighbor, Jacob told her, was a widow named Martha Holloway, whose homestead was a good 5 miles down the valley. They had no reason to visit, he said. Folks value their privacy out here. He explained a phrase he used often. It was his reason for not taking her into the nearest town, Redemption Gulch, which was a full day's ride away. It's a rough place, Sarah, full of dust and drunks. No place for a lady. I'll get all the supplies we need." His protectiveness, which had at first seemed charming, began to feel like a cage, gilded though it was. She wanted to see the town. She wanted to meet other people, to put a face to the name Martha Holloway. But Jacob was always firm, his smile never wavering. "There's no need. Everything we need is right here." Then there were the stories of his late wife Maria. He spoke of her rarely, and always with a rehearsed-sounding sadness. She was a gentle thing, he'd say, looking off into the distance. Too gentle for this land. Yet when Sarah, in an effort to make the cabin her own, began organizing his possessions, she found things that didn't fit the narrative. Tucked away in the back of a drawer in the main room, beneath a stack of old woolens, she found a small, exquisitely carved wooden songbird. It was beautiful, but it felt out of place. More curious was a small leather-bound book of poetry, its pages filled with passionate verses by English poets. On the inside cover, in delicate looping script, was an inscription: "To my Jacob, my wild hawk, tame my heart, but never your spirit. Forever yours, Maria." Sarah read the words, a strange chill creeping over her skin. A gentle thing. The woman who wrote this sounded fierce, passionate, alive. It didn't align with Jacob's sorrowful portrait of a fragile flower who wilted in the wilderness. She put the book back, a seed of unease planted in her mind. Why would he misrepresent her? Perhaps his grief was simply too deep to speak of her true nature. She tried to convince herself that was all it was. The incident she couldn't so easily explain away happened a few days later. A young man, a boy, really no older than 20, rode into their clearing, leading a pack mule. He had a shock of unruly blonde hair and a nervous energy about him. Jacob met him on the porch, his body instantly stiffening, his pleasant demeanor vanishing like a puff of smoke. "Cody," Jacob said, his voice flat and hard, "I told you I'd come to you when I needed supplies." The boy, Cody, swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Jacob to where Sarah stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning, ma'am," he mumbled quickly, looking away. "Sorry, Mr. Miller. My partner Riggs at the mercantile, he was just worried. Said you hadn't been in for well over 2 months. He sent me with some basics. Flour, salt, coffee. Said to put it on your account." Jacob's jaw was tight. "You tell your father I appreciate the thought, but I don't appreciate him sending his boy up here unannounced. This is private land." "Yes, sir. I know, sir." Cody stammered, clearly intimidated. "I'll just unload the flour and be on my way." As Cody worked, fumbling with the ropes on the mule, Jacob stood with his arms crossed, a silent, menacing statue. Sarah felt an awkward tension hang in the air. She offered Cody a glass of water, an act of simple decency. "Thank you kindly, ma'am," the boy said, his gratitude immense. He drank it down in 3 quick gulps, his eyes flicking nervously toward Jacob again, before he handed the glass back to Sarah. As their fingers brushed, he pressed a tiny folded piece of paper into her palm, his eyes wide with a silent, urgent plea. It was a gesture so swift and subtle, Jacob, who was watching the mule, didn't see it. Cody Riggs mounted his horse, gave a jerky nod, and spurred his horse out of the clearing, as if the devil himself were on his heels. Jacob turned to Sarah, his smile returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. "Nosy people. A man can't have a moment's peace." He picked up the sack of flour. "Still save me a trip." Sarah's heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She clenched her hand around the small piece of paper, the feel of it a burning secret in her palm. She waited until Jacob was in the root cellar storing the supplies before she dared to open it. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the note. The writing was a barely legible scrawl. "Are you safe, Ibrahim?" It read. That was all. 3 simple words that blew the idyllic fantasy of her new life to pieces. "Are you safe?" Why would a stranger, a boy she'd never met, ask her that? It implied she might not be. It implied that Jacob Miller, her kind, attentive future husband, was a man to be feared. The note confirmed the vague unease that had been coiling in her gut. The isolation, the contradictions about Maria Jacobs' cold dismissal of the supply boy, they weren't just quirks, they were warnings. That night, sleep offered no escape. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside sounded like a threat. She lay in her bed, her eyes wide open in the dark, listening to Jacob's steady breathing in the other room. It was no longer a comforting sound. It was the breathing of a stranger, a man with secrets. The open door she had walked through now felt like the entrance to a trap, and she was beginning to realize the lock had already turned. Her mind raced back to the stagecoach driver, Jedediah Stone. His non-committal words about Jacob, his unreadable expression. Had it been caution, pity? And what about Martha Holloway, the unseen neighbor? Did she know something? Did the whole valley know something that she, the intended bride, did not? A new terrifying thought took hold. What had happened to Maria? The harshness of the first winter, he had said. It was such a vague, poetic explanation. What if it wasn't the winter that had stolen her away? The book of poetry, the passionate inscription that was not a woman who would simply fade away. It was the writing of a woman who would fight. Sarah felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She was miles from any town, from any law, from anyone who knew her name. She was utterly, completely alone with a man she was beginning to suspect was not the person from the letters at all. The kind eyes, the gentle smile. Were they just a mask, and if so, what lay beneath? The question from the crumpled note echoed in the terrifying silence of the cabin. Are you safe? For the first time since her arrival, Sarah knew the honest answer was no. The crumpled note from Cody Riggs became a brand on Sarah's consciousness. Are you safe? The question pulsed with every beat of her heart, a constant, silent drum of fear beneath the placid surface of her days. She had to maintain the facade, to continue playing the part of the contented, trusting bride-to-be. Any shift in her behavior, any sign of suspicion, might provoke the man whose gentle demeanor now seemed as thin and fragile as a pane of glass. She became a student of Jacob Miller, watching him with a new desperate intensity. She observed the way his eyes would go cold and flat when he thought she wasn't looking, the subtle tightening of his jaw when a flock of birds unexpectedly took flight. She noticed that while his cabin was immaculately clean, his personal tools, his hunting knife, his axe, were always kept razor-sharp and unsettlingly close at hand. He was a man prepared for violence. Her exploration of the cabin became more furtive, more purposeful. His secrets, she felt certain, were locked away with the same quiet efficiency with which he ran his homestead. Her attention was drawn to a single, inexplicable feature of the cabin, a small, sturdy door off the main room. What, in a grander house, might be called a parlor. Unlike every other door in the house, this one was always locked. A heavy iron padlock secured the latch. "What's in that room, Jacob?" she had asked once, affecting a tone of simple curiosity as she dusted the mantelpiece. He had turned from cleaning his rifle, his movements momentarily ceasing. "Storage," he said, his voice even. "Things from before. Remnants of a life that's past." He offered a sad, practiced smile. "No need to trouble yourself with it. It's best to look forward, not back." His answer was meant to end the conversation, but it only fueled her obsession. Things from before. Maria's things. If so, why lock them away under a heavy padlock? Grief was one thing. This felt like something else entirely. It felt like a prison. The opportunity to investigate came a week after Cody's visit. A storm, which had been threatening for days, finally broke over the valley. The sky turned a bruised purple, and rain lashed against the windows in furious sheets. In the midst of the downpour, Jacob came inside, his face grim. "A piece of the fence is down by the north pasture," he announced, pulling on a heavy oilskin coat. "A couple of steers got out. I've got to go after them before they wander too far into the mountains. I won't be back before nightfall." He looked at her, and for a moment, She saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "You'll be all right here alone?" "Of course," she said, forcing a calm smile. "I'll keep the fire going and have supper ready for you." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. He strode to the door, then paused his hand on the latch. "Bolt the door behind me, Sarah. Don't open it for anyone." He gave her a long, hard look, and then he was gone, swallowed by the grey, swirling tempest. The moment the sound of his horse's hooves faded, Sarah's heart began to hammer. This was her chance. She bolted the main door as he'd instructed, then immediately turned her attention to the locked parlour. The padlock was old but strong. She had no key. Panic began to set in, the fear that her one opportunity would be wasted. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for anything she could use. Her gaze fell upon the fireplace. Next to it was a small collection of iron tools, a poker, a shovel, and a set of tongs. And hanging from a nail on the mantelpiece was a small, thin piece of metal Jacob used for cleaning the tight crevices of his rifle. A pick. With trembling hands, she took the rifle pick and a sturdy hairpin from her own hair. She remembered watching a locksmith in a Chicago market as a girl, his nimble fingers working their magic. She had no idea if she could replicate it, but she had to try. Kneeling before the locked door, she inserted the hairpin into the bottom of the keyhole, applying gentle pressure to turn the lock mechanism just as she'd seen the man do. Then, she slid the rifle pick into the top of the keyhole, her ears straining for the faintest sound. She began to probe to feel for the tumblers inside. It was maddeningly difficult. The metal scraped her fingers, grew numb, and sweat beaded on her forehead. Minutes stretched into an eternity, marked only by the drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of her own heart. She was about to give up when she felt it a tiny click. She adjusted the pressure on the hairpin. Another click, louder this time. Her breath hitched. One more. She probed carefully, with the pick her touch feather light, and then a solid, satisfying thunk. The mechanism turned. The padlock sprang open in her hand. For a moment she just knelt there, staring at the open lock, disbelief warring with terror. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she removed the lock, lifted the latch, and pulled the heavy door open. The air that wafted out was stale and smelled faintly of lavender and decay. The room was small, windowless, and shrouded in gloom. As her eyes adjusted, she saw that it was a bedroom, but one frozen in time. A thick layer of dust covered everything, sparkling in the slivers of light that crept under the door. There was a bed neatly made, an oak wardrobe, and a small vanity table with a silver-backed brush and comb set laid out, as if its owner had just stepped away. This had been Maria's room, but it wasn't a shrine, it was a prison cell. Scratches marred the inside of the door, clustered around the latch, long, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had clawed at it, desperately trying to get out. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah. Her gaze was drawn to a small writing desk in the corner. On its surface lay a stack of papers, seemingly untouched. The top page was a letter dated over a year ago. The handwriting was the same delicate looping script from the book of poetry. Sarah picked it up. "My dearest Clara," the letter began. "I pray this letter reaches you. I do not know if he is sending my mail. The man I married, Clara, is not the man from the letters. The Jacob Miller whose words charmed you and whose photograph you hold died on the trail coming west. He was a good man. The man who now calls himself Jacob Miller killed him. His name is Silas Kane, and he is a monster." Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, the letter clutched in her hand. The world tilted on its axis. Jacob Miller was dead. The man she had been living with, the man who had smiled at her and taught her to milk a cow, was an imposter, a killer. Silas Kane. Her mind reeled. The photograph. Silas must have found it with the real Jacob's belongings and assumed his identity, using his well-worded letters to lure a bride to this isolated valley, a place where no one would question him. With a growing sense of horror, she continued to read Maria's frantic words. "He keeps me a prisoner here. He is charming when he wants to be, but underneath it is a coldness that terrifies me. He wants the legitimacy a wife provides, a shield against any suspicion from the few people who pass through. He wants a servant. I tried to leave once. He caught me. The beating was severe, but the worst part was the look in his eyes. He enjoyed it. He has locked me in this room. He brings food and water, but he will not let me out. I am scratching at the door until my fingernails bleed. Please, Clara. If you love your brother, send help. Send the law. Something is deeply wrong in this valley. Do not write back to him. He will know. Send someone. Sarah scrambled through the rest of the papers. They were all letters, all addressed to Clara Miller in St. Louis. None of them had been sent. They were a chronicle of Maria's descent into hell, her hope dwindling with each passing day. The last letter was unfinished. The handwriting was weak, spidery. He says I am becoming ill. He says the winter is too hard on me. He is right. I am fading. But it is not the cold that is killing me, Clara. It is the despair. And it is the small doses of something he puts in my evening tea. He thinks I do not know. He is slowly poisoning me. He smiles while he does it. Remember me, Clara. Remember your brother Jacob. Do not let him be forgot. The ink trailed off. Sarah dropped the letter as if it had burned her. It all made sense. Maria wasn't a fragile soul. She was a fighter. And Silas Kane had silenced her slowly, methodically, right here in this cabin. He had likely buried her somewhere out in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, telling the world it was the winter that took her. And now he had brought another woman here to replace her. A floorboard creaked in the main room. Sarah froze her blood, turning to ice. He was back. He wasn't supposed to be back. The storm, the lost cattle, was it a lie? A test. She scrambled to her feet, her mind a maelstrom of terror. She had to get the letters, get out of the room, lock the door, and pretend nothing had happened. She shoved the stack of letters into the bodice of her dress, the brittle paper crinkling against her skin. She swung the parlor door shut, her fumbling hands trying to fit the heavy padlock back into the latch. The main cabin door bolt slid open with a loud metallic scrape. There was no time. She couldn't get the lock on. She did the only thing she could think of. She dropped the padlock on the floor, kicked it under the edge of a nearby rug, and flew to the fireplace, grabbing the poker, just as Silas Kane stepped through the door, dripping rainwater onto the floor. He looked at her, his eyes taking in the scene. Her wild-eyed panic, her flushed face, the poker clutched in her white-knuckled hand. His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to the parlor door, then back to her. The kind, gentle mask of Jacob Miller dissolved, melting away to reveal the cold, predatory countenance of Silas Kane. The smile he gave her was not a smile of warmth, but a baring of teeth. "Find something interesting, Sarah," he asked, his voice a low, deadly purr. The charade was over. The air in the cabin crackled thick with the unspoken truth. The man standing before her, soaked and menacing, was a stranger. The illusion of Jacob Miller had been utterly shattered, leaving only the chilling reality of Silas Kane. Sarah's mind, which moments before had been a whirlwind of panic, sharpened to a single terrifying point of clarity. She was going to die here, just like Maria, unless she fought. "The cattle?" she asked. Her voice surprisingly steady, the iron poker held tight in her hand. It was a flimsy weapon against a man his size, but it was all she had. Silas chuckled, a low guttural sound that had nothing of Jacob's warmth in it. He took a step into the room, unbuttoning his oilskin coat. "The cattle are fine. I had a feeling I shouldn't leave you alone for too long. A woman's curiosity. It's a dangerous thing." His eyes flicked again to the parlor door, and then to the lump under the rug where she had kicked the padlock. He knew. "What do you want, Silas?" she said, using the name from the letter. It was a gamble, a way of telling him she knew everything, of seizing some small measure of control. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the last vestiges of his manufactured surprise vanishing. "So, You did find Maria's little diary. He shook his head, a parody of disappointment. A shame. I was beginning to like you, Sarah. You're a better worker than she was. Quieter. He took another step, his movements slow, deliberate, like a wolf, circling its cornered prey. What I want is what I had. A quiet life, a respectable name, a wife to cook my meals and warm my bed and keep anyone from asking too many questions. And when you grow tired of her, or when she learns the truth? Sarah shot back, her voice laced with a venom she didn't know she possessed. Do you poison her too? Bury her out where no one will ever find her? His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. Maria was weak. She fought me at every turn. She wouldn't accept her place. He gestured around the cabin. I built this. This is my land. I killed a man for it. I won't have it taken from me by a whining woman. He lunged. Sarah didn't hesitate. She swung the poker with all her might, not at his head, but at the kerosene lamp on the table. The iron struck glass, and the lamp exploded in a shower of shattered fragments and burning oil. Flames erupted, leaping up the dry wood of the table and licking at the curtains. Silas roared in surprise and anger, shielding his face as he backed away from the sudden inferno. The fire was her only ally, a chaotic, unpredictable force in the small enclosed space. It created a diversion, a wall of heat and light between them. You foolish girl! He bellowed, his eyes wild with rage. Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She ran. Not for the main door, he was too close to it, but for the small window in her own bedroom at the back of the cabin. She slammed her bedroom door shut, fumbling to wedge the small wooden chair from her room under the knob. It wouldn't hold him for long, but it might give her seconds. The window was small, but she was slender. With frantic strength, she unlatched it and pushed it open. Outside, the storm still raged, the wind howling the rain, a cold, stinging torrent. She could hear Silas pounding on the other side of the door, the wood groaning in protest. She threw one leg over the sill, then the other, and dropped to the muddy ground below landing with a painful jolt. She didn't pause. She scrambled to her feet and ran, heedless of the thorny bushes that tore at her dress and the slick mud that threatened to pull her down. She ran towards the one place she could think of, the stable. Her only hope of outrunning him was on horseback. Behind her, she heard the splintering crash of her bedroom door giving way. The stable was 100 yards from the cabin. It felt like a mile. The rain plastered her hair to her face, blinding her. The letters from Maria, still tucked in her bodice, felt like a lead weight, a testament to the fate she was so desperately trying to escape. She reached the stable, her lungs burning, and slid the heavy wooden bar from the door. Inside, the smell of hay and horse was a strange comfort. Jacob's Silas's gelding, a big, powerful roan, stood in its stall, its eyes wide and nervous from the storm and the growing orange glow from the cabin. Her own mount, a gentler mare named Daisy he had bought for her, was in the next stall. There was no time for a saddle. She grabbed a bridle from a peg, her fingers clumsy and slick with rain. She entered Daisy's stall, murmuring soothing words to the frightened animal. As she slipped the bit into the mare's mouth, she heard him. He was shouting her name, his voice a furious roar carried on the wind. She led Daisy out of the stall. Using a mounting block, she swung herself onto the horse's bare back, her wet dress hiking up around her thighs. She gathered to the reins, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She nudged the mare with her heels, urging her toward the open stable door. And there he was. Silas Kane stood in the doorway, blocking her path. His face was illuminated by the flickering light of the burning cabin, his expression demonic. He held a pitchfork in his hands, its tines glinting. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled. For a heartbeat, Sarah froze. This was it, the end of the line. But then she looked past him at the fire consuming the cabin, the monument to his lies. She thought of Maria's desperate clawed-up door. She thought of the poison in the tea. A surge of pure, primal rage eclipsed her fear. She let out a piercing scream, a sound of fury and defiance, and kicked Daisy hard in the flanks. The mare, already spooked, bolted forward. Silas braced himself, lowering the pitchfork like a soldier's pike. But Sarah did something he didn't expect. Instead of trying to swerve around him, she leaned low over Daisy's neck and pulled hard on the right rein at the last second. The mare, startled by the sudden command, veered sharply. It wasn't enough to clear the doorway, but it was enough to change the angle of impact. Instead of meeting the pitchfork head-on, Daisy's powerful shoulder slammed into Silas. The man was strong, but he was no match for the momentum of a 1,000-pound animal. He was thrown sideways with a sickening crunch, the pitchfork flying from his grasp. He hit the wooden wall of the stable hard and crumpled to the ground in a heap. Sarah didn't look back. She urged Daisy out into the storm, away from the burning cabin, away from the man lying broken in the mud. She didn't know if he was dead or alive, and she didn't care. She rode blindly, letting the mare choose her path, guided only by the desperate instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and the horror of Shadow Creek Valley. She rode through the night, the storm her only companion. The wind tore at her, the rain chilled her to the bone, but she didn't stop. She was fueled by adrenaline and the terrifying knowledge of what she had escaped. Clutched in her hand were the reins, her lifeline. Tucked in her dress were the letters, her proof. She was no longer Sarah Jenkins, the hopeful mail-order bride. She was a survivor, a fugitive riding through the tempest, carrying the truth out of the shadows. Her gamble had not been for a husband or a home, but for her very life, and against all odds, she was winning. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and raw. Sarah rode on an automaton of exhaustion and will. The landscape was a blur of grey rock and sodden earth. Daisy, her brave mare, was tiring her pace, slowing to a steady plodding walk. Sarah had no idea where she was, only that she was heading east, away from the Valley of Shadows. It was late in the afternoon when she saw him, a lone rider on the horizon, heading toward her. A fresh wave of panic seized her. Had Silas recovered? Was he coming for her? She pulled the Daisy to a halt, her body tensing, ready to flee again. But as the rider drew closer, she saw it wasn't Silas. This man was older, heavier set, and was leading a pack mule. It was Cody Riggs, the boy from the mercantile. He recognized her at the same time, his eyes widening in shock. He spurred his horse forward, closing the distance between them. "Mrs. Miller! Sarah!" He cried out, his young face a mask of concern. "My God, what happened to you? We saw the smoke from down the valley." Tears, hot and sudden, finally streamed down Sarah's face, mingling with the rain and dirt. The sight of a friendly face, the sound of her own name spoken with kindness, broke the dam of her composure. The story came pouring out of her in a torrent of ragged, desperate words. The locked room, the letters, the name Silas Kane, the fire, the escape. Cody listened, his expression shifting from confusion to horror and then to grim understanding. "We always thought there was something wrong about him," he said, his voice low. "My pa, Mr. Riggs, he said Miller Kane paid in cash and never talked. And folks who went up that valley, they didn't always come back. Old man Hemlock, a prospector, went up there 2 years ago and vanished. Kane said he'd moved on to California." He shook his head. "We suspected, but we had no proof." "I have proof," Sarah whispered, her hand going to her bodice. She pulled out Maria's letters, the paper damp and creased, but still legible. "He killed the real Jacob Miller, and he murdered his wife, Maria." Cody's jaw set with a man's resolve. "Redemption Gulch is a half a day's ride from here. You're exhausted. My pa's hunting camp is just over this ridge. It's dry and there's food. You can rest there. I'll ride to town and get Sheriff Brody." Sarah could only nod, a wave of profound relief making her dizzy. Cody led her to the small hidden camp. He built her a fire, gave her a blanket and a piece of dried venison, which she ate ravenously. He made sure she was safe and hidden from the main trail before he mounted his horse again. "You're a brave woman, Sarah," he said, looking at her with an awe that embarrassed her. "Don't you worry. The law will handle Silas Kane." He rode off, and Sarah was alone again, but this time the solitude was a comfort. She huddled by the fire wrapped in the coarse wool blanket, and finally, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she slept a deep, dreamless sleep. It was dusk when Sheriff Brody and a posse of 5 grim-faced men, led by Cody, arrived at the camp. The sheriff was a tall, quiet man with a weathered face and intelligent eyes. He listened to her story again, his expression unreadable as he carefully read through Maria's letters, holding them gently as if they were sacred relics. When he was done, he folded them carefully and tucked them into his coat. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice laced with respect, "you've been through a terrible ordeal, and you've done this county a great service." He turned to his men. "We ride for the Miller homestead. He may be injured, but he's dangerous. Shoot to kill if you have to." Sarah remained at the camp under the protection of Mr. Riggs, Cody's father, a kind, quiet man who treated her with gentle deference. The wait was agonizing. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt of fear through her. It was nearly dawn when the posse returned. They were not leading a prisoner. "He's gone," Sheriff Brody reported, his voice heavy as he dismounted. "The cabin is burned to the foundation. We found a blood trail leading from the stable into the rocks. A lot of blood. Looks like that horse did a real number on him. He's bad hurt, but he still managed to get away." The sheriff's men had made a grim discovery while searching the grounds. Near the creek bed, under a cairn of heavy stones, they found a shallow grave. The remains inside were skeletal, but a silver locket found amongst them was inscribed with the name Maria. A little further into the woods, they found another older grave. This one held the bones of a man, and with him a wallet containing the identification of Jacob Miller of St. Louis. Silas Kane had vanished. A manhunt was organized, and his name and description were sent by telegraph to every lawman in the territory. But the wilderness was vast, and a man who knew how to disappear could do so easily. Sarah stayed in Redemption Gulch for a week, giving her official testimony. The townspeople who had once viewed Jacob Miller with distant suspicion now looked upon Sarah with a mixture of pity and awe. She was the woman who had survived the monster of Shadow Creek. The most difficult meeting was with Martha Holloway, the widow neighbor. The older woman came to town to see her, her face etched with a profound, weary guilt. "I knew something was wrong," Martha confessed, her voice trembling as they sat in the town's small church. "Maria, she smuggled a note to me once, a few weeks before she disappeared. It was a cry for help. I was a widow alone. I was afraid of him. I went to the sheriff at the time, but he was a lazy drunk. He did nothing. I did nothing." Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks. "I have lived with that shame every day. Can you ever forgive me?" Sarah looked at the tormented woman and saw not a coward, but another victim of Silas Kane's reign of terror. She reached out and took Martha's hand. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her voice soft. "He made everyone afraid. You can't live in the past." It was the same advice Silas had given her, but from her own lips it had a different meaning. It was not about burying guilt, but about choosing to live. Sarah had nothing. Her meager savings were gone. Her dreams of a home and family were ashes. The railroad offered her a ticket back to Chicago, a return to the life she had fled. But as she stood at the small train depot, looking not at the tracks leading east, but at the jagged, majestic mountains to the west, she realized something profound. She didn't want to go back. The woman who had left Chicago was gone. That Sarah Jenkins had been timid, hopeful, and naive. The woman who stood here now was different. She had faced down a monster and survived. She had been tested by the raw, untamed West, and had not broken. The wilderness she had once feared now looked like a challenge, a place of possibility. She turned away from the train. She sold her mother's locket, her last tie to her old life, for a small sum. With the money, and with a loan from a surprisingly kind Mr. Riggs at the mercantile, she bought a small plot of land on the edge of town, a place with a clear view of the mountains. She would not be a bride or a servant. She would be a homesteader. She would build her own cabin plant, her own garden, make her own life. It would be hard, and she would be alone, but she would be free. Her future was no longer a blank wall, but an open frontier. Her new life hadn't been given to her by a man with a welcoming smile and an open door. It was a life she had seized for herself from the heart of a fire in the middle of a storm. And as she looked towards the horizon, Sarah felt not fear, but the quiet, unshakable strength of a new dawn. Sarah's story is a stark, gripping reminder of the courage it took to carve out a life in the Old West, where promises could be as empty as the prairie and survival depended on one's own unyielding grit. The frontier was filled with countless stories like hers, tales of breathtaking hope, terrifying deception, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. She went seeking a home and a husband, but found something far more valuable, her own strength. Her journey wasn't about the man who greeted her with a smile, but about the woman she became after she slammed the door on his lies. If you were captivated by Sarah's harrowing journey into the heart of the unknown, please honor her memory and the countless women like her by giving this video a like. Share it with someone who loves a powerful, true-to-life story, and be sure to subscribe for more dramas from the pages of history. Don't forget to click that notification bell so you don't miss our next tale from the wild frontier.